What's up, guys? Gonna talk about 17 mixing mistakes that noobs make, and I definitely made all of these mistakes at one point or another. So if you're doing any of these, you wanna try and stop. All right, let's get right into it. Newbie mixing mistake number one, always mixing in solo. It's very tempting to just hit that solo button and then pull up your EQ and your compression, make it sound amazing, and then jump out of solo into the context of the mix and then use the fader to balance that in. That is a recipe for having a mix that has no glue. No end listener out there who's listening to your final mix is ever gonna hear that track in solo, whether it's the snare or the tom or even the vocal. They're not hearing it like that. So you wanna mix how the final listener is gonna hear it and make sure everything glues together. It's gonna stop you from wasting a lot of time on stuff that doesn't matter. It's gonna help you focus on the things that do matter, and it's a hard habit to break. You gotta discipline yourself and just stop hitting that button. Mistake number two, spray and pray panning. What I mean is just having things panned out like at all different wacky areas of the stereo spectrum. So rather than just having left, center, right, and that's pretty much it, a lot of people just pan things all different places in between. They might have something at 50%. They might have guitars out wide and then another layer of guitars that for whatever reason they think is better to just pan in like a little bit, like 80%. At the same time, everyone wants these big wide mixes. The secret to wide mixes is having things separate. If you want wide mixes, then stop panning things in between. You need difference if you want things to sound wide. The more you pan stuff in between, it's just gonna sound that much narrower. Mistake number three, making baby moves. This kind of goes along with number one, mixing in solo. When you're mixing in solo, you'll make really small moves with, let's say, an EQ or a compression. You know, you'll do a little small cut or a little boost or something like that, and you'll think it makes a difference, but in the context of the mix, it doesn't matter. Or you'll think maybe something needs to be louder or quieter, and you'll pull it down by like 0.5 dB with, you know, the volume automation lane. And sometimes a small move is required, but most of the time, it doesn't really matter. And again, you're just in your head, you're being guided by your eyes too much, and so you make these baby moves. So if you're gonna make a move, just like I said about panning, be bold. Mistake number four is right up the same alley, mixing with your eyes. So look, it's like a scientifically observed fact that we rely 80% on our eyes to inform our other senses, including our ears. I mean, I think of myself when I go to the store to try and pick up a new kind of beer to try out. I am so influenced by the label. I will pick the beer with the coolest label, assuming that the flavor is also cool. And we do the same thing in mixing, especially today with the plugins that are getting more and more advanced and complex. And it seems like every EQ plugin out there has like the frequency graph where you can see things and you can put up a reference track and like A/B it, and you can see the frequency curve, and you start making decisions based on that, and you trick yourself into thinking something sounds better just because it looks the way you think it should look. It makes no sense at all, but we are so influenced by what we see. So I know this about myself, and I know that when I get too focused on what I'm seeing, I make bad mix decisions. And so I purposely use plugins like the SSL channel that don't have that frequency graph and they don't have the analyzer popping up, and that just allows me to just turn knobs and listen. Number five, Band-Aid fixes. Now, when it comes to mixing, to me, a Band-Aid fix means like, okay, my drums are not sounding as punchy as I want. Let's go to the drum bus, or let's go to the master fader of the whole mix and put on something there to try and make things more exciting. And it's kind of like the top-down approach. That's why I don't really favor it. I find it's a Band-Aid approach. I like to mix foundation up. In fact, I like to produce and record foundation up, but that's the number one Band-Aid, is trying to polish a turd, right? It's like trying to make something sound good that is a bad performance, it's out of tune, bad timing. Well, you're not gonna be able to fix that with a Band-Aid in mixing. But you wanna approach your mixing the same way and not have a huge chain of plugins on your mix bus doing a bunch of heavy lifting and multi-band compression and all this crazy stuff that where you bypass the mix bus chain, the whole mix and falls apart. And sometimes it just means like scratching and starting over what you're doing on a track. Let's say you're on a bass track and you end up having like 5 or 6 plugins on and you're still not happy with it. Well, rather than put a 7th plugin on and try to fix that, sometimes you need to just bypass everything and be like, hey, wait a second, was it better before I did any of this? And then you just kind of like start over and build the foundation again. Mistake number 6, never committing. So what does never committing look like in the mix? Well, to me, that's things like if you're gonna add in a drum sample, you have it live triggering the whole time, and you don't actually print it down to an audio track. And the reason that's a mistake is because it's gonna throw off your workflow, and you're gonna have this doubt or this temptation to change things like really late into your mix. Like you don't wanna get 3 hours into your mix and then go back and say to yourself, I wonder what this would sound like with a completely different kick sound or a completely different snare sound. And you don't want to get 5 hours into your mix and then reamp and change the guitar tone. So you want to remove that temptation and keep the momentum up in your mixes by committing. So for me, I'll spend a few minutes auditioning different kick and snare samples, and then once I find one that I like, I'll commit it down to an audio track and get rid of the trigger track so that I'm not tempted to go and switch it up again. Same thing with amp sim guitars. Most of the time I will commit that down to an actual audio track of the tone, just as if I had recorded a mic on a cab. And that way I'm not tempted to second guess myself and go back and change the tone partway through a mix. Because if you keep doing that kind of stuff, you'll never finish the mix. You'll constantly change and start over, but that doesn't work. You know, for a mix to sound good and exciting and glued, you need your decisions to kind of compound on top of each other. You need to commit to something that influences the next sound, you commit that influences the next move, and so on. And that's how you craft a nice, big, glued together, exciting mix. Mistake number 7, blurring the mixing and editing phase. I'm a huge believer that when you're mixing, you should just be mixing. You should not be tuning the vocals partway through or editing the drums partway through or fixing timing. Make sure you listen to the song, get familiar with the session, and anything that needs to be fixed, editing, tuning wise, timing wise, you need to take care of that before you actually start mixing. That leads into mistake number 8, which is not having a consistent workflow. So you really want to approach the mix the same way every time, every song. So what do you start with? Do you start with the drums? Do you start with the vocals? You know, do you build it in that order? Do you save automation for the end? Do you do it at the beginning? Like, you want to have this workflow really solid. You know, for me, I mix in the same 7-step workflow every single time, and I've been doing it for like over 10 years. So I know that when I get to the last step, after I've done the automation, I do my final listen through and my final tweaks, I can be confident that the mix is done. Mistake number 9 is not having a standard organization. And what I mean by organization is just simple things like, how do you name the tracks? What's the order that the tracks appear across your screen? And the reason this is important is because you want to be able to mix fast without thinking too much. You want to be in the zone, like mixing with your gut. If you're constantly like, wait, where was that track again? What did I call that track? What, you know, where was that tambourine? Was it at the top of the session? Was it at the bottom of the session? You don't want to be confused by those things. You want to be able to very quickly reach for what you want. It's kind of like an old school mixer, like Chris Lord-Alge, mixing on the same console for decades. I can pretty much guarantee you that he's got the kick and the snare and the vocal fader in the same spot on the console all the time. It's not like it's way over to his left one day and the next day the kick is like way over here. No, it's become muscle memory, right? He's like, if he wants to reach for the kick, probably doesn't even have to look at it. Probably just reaches and knows exactly where it is. And you want to set up your DAW sessions the same way so that you can just be reactive and not taken out of the zone by having to search for something and be lost in your own session. Mistake number 10 is smiley face syndrome. Well, smiley face syndrome is when you put the smiley face EQ on everything. And that means you cut out mid-range, you know, you cut out the boxiness or the muddiness in the low mids and the mids, and then you boost the low end and then you boost the high end. And the thing is, in solo, pretty much every track in your mix is gonna sound better when you do this. But in the context of a mix, if you do this everywhere, you end up with a mix that has no power, you've sucked out kind of the character and the mid-range from it, and it's not gonna translate anywhere. So the cure for smiley face syndrome is to try to avoid cutting things or boosting things out of habit. Make sure you're guided by your ears, and to stop mixing in solo. If you stop mixing in solo very much, then you will by and large part avoid smiley face syndrome. Mistake number 11, static mixes. You need your mixes to change and evolve and grow and build throughout a track. For example, sometimes, you know, we'll have cymbals or a vocal that have a certain EQ at the beginning of the song, but then by the end of the song, we've actually turned up the high-end frequency boost on an EQ as the song is building and growing. That's a little more advanced, but a simpler example is just volume automation, right? Are you turning up that drum fill? Are you turning up the downbeat of the chorus to make things pop louder? And when the song's supposed to pull back and get quieter, are you bringing down the guitar and the bass and the drums to create that space so that ending can hit even harder? You don't want to just do your mix and then have the faders at a static level and then bounce it out and finish it. That's not a finished mix. You need to be automating, and that's really where the energy and the feel and the performance comes in as a mixer. That's my favorite stage of the mix. Mistake number 12, always being distracted. Talking about this stupid little thing right here. Almost like 3 times a week, I'm tempted to just smash this phone on the ground. I hate how distracting it is, but even on the computer these days, it's so easy to be pulled into Facebook or Instagram or checking your email when you should be mixing. When you're mixing, you should start, let's say at 9 a.m. in the morning, and then you don't touch anything else until like it's done, maybe 6 or 8 hours later. And whenever I have those kind of days mixing, I do my best work. It feels the most rewarding, and I come out with a mix that I'm happy with. But most people these days have ADD. Like, it's really hard to focus in the world today. We're so trained to be hooked on our devices and everything, and you're probably mixing, you've got text messages popping up, emails popping up. You want to go and see if someone commented on your Instagram post, or you want to post about your mix on Instagram as you're doing it. All of this is going to make your mix worse. So stop being distracted. You have to actually focus. And I think the ability to focus is going to be a huge advantage for anyone in any field of work going forward, including audio. Noob mixing mistake number 13, sharing your mix before it's done. Now, whether it's asking feedback from just the audio community or a friend, or worst of all, sending it to a client, you never want to do this. I learned this early on. Like, I'll get halfway through a mix and maybe I was feeling really excited about it and thinking it was like really going in a good direction, or I did something cool. And I'll send it to the band and be like, hey, just a heads up, I think it's sounding awesome. Check out this work in progress. Man, that's really gonna mess them up, and it's gonna mess you up. So don't ask people for feedback before you're finished with the mix. I never show a mix to anyone until I've finished it here in my studio, I've taken it out to my car, I've listened to it on AirPods, and I've really, made all the tweaks that I think I should make before I'm 100% confident in it. And you don't want to be led all over the place with feedback before you've even finished what you set out to do. So finish it first, make sure you are very confident that you've done everything you can to make the song as good as it can possibly sound, then get feedback. Number 14, referencing too much. You don't want to be comparing your mixes to other mixes too much as you're working. Now, it's important to reference a little bit, but I recommend doing it in a specific way. First of all, before you start mixing, listen to some reference tracks, some mixes that you know really well in your room, on your speakers, just to kind of ground your ears and kind of get your mind in the ballpark of how bright or how bassy or how mid-rangey things should sound in general, then dive into your mix. Then you'll want to pop up maybe partway through your mix. Again, just check at the low end, make sure you have enough sub rumble, make sure you have enough brightness on the vocal and on the drums, then get back into your mix. I'm talking like 30 seconds to a minute of referencing here. And then lastly, do it like one final time as you think like, okay, I'm pretty close to finishing this mix. Do another quick comparison, just bounce really quickly between your mix and some reference tracks, and then make any final tweaks you think necessary. And my advice is that you avoid those plugins where you're dragging in reference tracks into your DAW and especially like I said, visually analyzing the frequency response between those, because then all of a sudden you're not mixing anymore. You're trying to copy. Don't do that. You're gonna make your mix worse. So make sure you have the overall frequency ballpark right, the amount of low end, the amount of high end. Make sure it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb as you switch back and forth, and that's all you need to do for referencing. Mistake number 15, too much reverb. This one's kind of like the smiley face EQ. If you solo a track and put some nice lush sounding reverb on there, everything sounds better. If you put reverb on everything in your mix, you're gonna end up with a really dull, kind of cloudy sounding mix. It's gonna sound like there's a bit of a blanket over the speakers. So especially for rock, for heavy music, man, even in pop these days, you don't use much reverb. In fact, I don't even put reverb on vocals 90% of the time. And unless I really want a deliberate effect, like a really massive, echoing reverb on a big snare to make it a big cannon gunshot kind of effect or something like that, or to make something sound really distant and far away, I'm pretty much almost never using reverb in the mix. All right, we're getting close to the end. There's two more. Mistake number 16 is too much surgery. Now, in the early days of mixing, I would have these little tiny baby notch cuts all over the place in the mix because I was mixing in solo and I was using my eyes. So I would hit solo on a track and then I just put this big boost up and sweep it across, and if anything stood out in a weird way, then I would notch it out and I would think that I was doing a good thing. And look, those kind of moves are sometimes necessary when there's a big problem. For the most part, they're not really contributing to the mix. Making your mix exciting and energetic and having things be punchy and stick out, that comes from making bold moves, not these little surgical cuts. And this really is, I think, a symptom of mistake number 1, mixing in solo, because you're gonna hear all these little issues that aren't really issues, but you think they are because you're just hyper focusing on it. So don't go searching with your magnifying glass for problems. Instead, you wanna only dive in and fix a problem like that when you hear it. All right, newbie mistake number 17, ironically, is watching too many YouTube tutorials. So look, YouTube is amazing. It can help you solve specific problems. It can give you kind of the foundational building blocks, the foundational knowledge to get started with things in recording and mixing and lots of other things as well. But it's not gonna take you all the way. And the reason this can be a mistake is because there's a lot of conflicting advice out there, right? More and more these days, I keep having people tell me I've hit a wall with YouTube. I keep getting led in all these different directions. I need one system. I need one workflow and process to focus on so I don't keep getting confused. You can see how this connects to a lot of the other mistakes, like not having a consistent workflow or a consistent organization and things like that, and band-aid fixes. A lot of those problems happen because you're hearing too many voices. And what you want to do is focus. That stands for follow one course until successful. So instead of making an inch of progress in 10 directions and then going and watching more tutorials and then starting over and trying something else, you want to make a mile of progress in one direction. And you can only do that if you kind of commit to one path, one mentor, and go all in in on that and you're gonna make way more progress. Just shut out the noise at a certain point. Just stop watching YouTube tutorials, commit to one philosophy, and just go. And if you wanna make really serious progress really quickly in the quality of your recordings and mixes, and you need good training and you need good mentorship like mine, I have a program called the Pro Production System. And if you wanna learn more about how it works and how we train engineers and mixers to get pro competitive label quality records and mixes, just click the link in the description below and you can learn more about the program and apply for it there. So there you go, 17 newbie mixing mistakes. If you're making any of these, like I said, you just gotta try and stop and your mixes will benefit for it. So hope you guys enjoyed this. Talk to you later.